I was excited to be driving with my friends on a road trip. The sun was setting, and the sky was turning a beautiful shade of orange. We were laughing and chatting away, the music was blasting, and we were having the time of our lives. As we were driving, I noticed a car following us. At first, I didn't think anything of it, but as time passed, I realized that the car had been behind us for quite a while. I told my friends about it, but they didn't seem to care. They were too busy enjoying the ride. The car continued to follow us, and I started to feel uneasy. Every time we turned, the car would follow. It was like the driver knew exactly where we were going. I tried to shake it off, but my anxiety was getting the best of me. We came to a deserted stretch of road, and the car behind us suddenly sped up and pulled alongside us. I could see a figure inside the car, but I couldn't make out who it was. Suddenly, the car swerved towards us, and I had to quickly swerve out of the way to avoid a collision. My heart was racing, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins. We continued to drive, but the car behind us was still following. I knew that we had to get away from it as soon as possible. We turned onto a small dirt road, hoping that it would lead us to safety. But instead, it led us straight into a dark, dense forest. The car behind us was still following, and I could hear the sound of its engine getting louder and louder. Suddenly, we hit a pothole and our car came to a sudden stop. The car behind us screeched to a halt, and the driver got out. I could see him walking towards us, and I knew that we were in trouble. I tried to start the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. We were stuck, and there was nowhere to go. The driver of the other car was getting closer and closer, and I could see the glint of a knife in his hand. That was the last thing I saw before everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. My friends were there, and they told me that we had been found by a passing car. The police were investigating, but they had no leads. To this day, I still have nightmares about that night. I don't know who was following us or why, but I know that I never want to experience anything like that again. The road trip that was supposed to be fun and exciting turned into a terrifying nightmare that I'll never forget. After the incident in the forest, I was too scared to even think about driving. Every time I saw a car behind us, my heart would start racing, and I would break out into a cold sweat. I knew that I had to get over my fear if I wanted to move on with my life. Eventually, I decided to take a driving course. It was tough, but I pushed through it, and before long, I was back behind the wheel. But even though I was driving again, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was following me. One night, I was driving home from work when I noticed a car following me. It was the same car that had followed us on the road trip. I tried to shake it off, but the car kept following me, no matter where I went. I knew that I had to do something before it was too late. I drove to the police station and explained the situation to them. They took my statement and promised to look into it. But as I was leaving the station, I saw the car parked across the street. I knew that I was in trouble. I got into my car and tried to drive away, but the car behind me was still there. I could see the driver's face now, and it was the same man who had followed us on the road trip. He looked crazed, and I knew that he was after me. I drove as fast as I could, trying to lose him, but he was too persistent. I could see him gaining on me, and I knew that I had to do something drastic. I veered off the road and into a ditch, hoping that he would follow me. But instead, he drove past me, laughing hysterically. I watched as his car disappeared into the night, and I knew that I had escaped with my life. But the fear and the trauma stayed with me for a long time. Driving was never the same for me after that. Every time I got into a car, I felt like I was being watched. I knew that I had to learn to trust again, but it was hard. The road trip that was supposed to be fun had turned into a nightmare that haunted me for years to come. Years passed, and I thought that I had put the nightmare behind me. But then, one day, I received a letter in the mail. It was from the man who had followed us on the road trip. He had been in jail all these years, but now he was out, and he was coming for me. I tried to ignore the letter and go about my life as usual, but the fear started to creep back in. Every time I got into a car, I felt like I was being watched again. I knew that I had to do something before it was too late. I decided to take self-defense classes and to arm myself. I bought a pepper spray and a taser, and I learned how to use them. I practiced driving techniques that would help me escape from dangerous situations, and I made sure to always lock my car doors. One night, as I was driving home from work, I saw the same car that had followed us on the road trip. I knew that it was him, and I knew that I had to act fast. I hit the gas pedal and drove as fast as I could, trying to lose him. But he was persistent, and he kept following me. I could see him in my rearview mirror, and I knew that he was getting closer. I reached for my pepper spray and prepared to use it. As he pulled up alongside me, I rolled down my window and sprayed him with the pepper spray. He screamed and swerved off the road, crashing into a tree. I drove away as fast as I could, tears streaming down my face. I knew that it wasn't over yet. He would come back, and I had to be ready. I started taking driving lessons again, learning how to handle high-speed chases and evasive maneuvers. But even though I was prepared, the fear never left me. Every time I got into a car, I felt like I was being watched. The road trip that was supposed to be fun had turned into a nightmare that had changed my life forever. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. I still had nightmares about the man who had followed us on the road trip. Every time I got behind the wheel, I felt like he was watching me, waiting for his chance to strike again. One night, I was driving home from a friend's house when I saw the same car that had followed us on the road trip. My heart stopped, and I felt the panic rise in my chest. I knew that I had to do something before it was too late. I tried to drive faster, but the car kept gaining on me. I tried to make a turn, but the car followed me, never losing sight of me. I knew that I had to take drastic measures if I wanted to survive. I remembered the driving lessons I had taken and started to implement the evasive maneuvers I had learned. I made sharp turns, drove through alleys, and even went the wrong way down a one-way street. But the car behind me kept following me, never giving up. I felt like I was in a nightmare, a never-ending chase that would only end in my death. But then, I saw the police lights behind me. I pulled over, and the car that had been following me sped off into the night. The police took my statement, and they promised to find the man who had been following me. They never did, but the fear stayed with me. I knew that I had to be vigilant and that I could never let my guard down. Driving became a source of fear and anxiety for me. Every time I got behind the wheel, I felt like I was putting my life in danger. But I refused to let the man who had followed us on the road trip control my life. I continued to take self-defense classes and to arm myself. I made sure to always be aware of my surroundings, and I never let my guard down. And even though the fear never left me, I knew that I had the skills and the determination to protect myself. The road trip that was supposed to be fun had turned into a nightmare that had changed my life forever. But I refused to let it define me. I would never let my guard down, and I would always be ready to protect myself. Months passed, and I thought that I had finally managed to move on from the horror of that road trip. But one night, as I was driving home from work, I saw a car in my rearview mirror. It was the same car that had followed us on the road trip, and my heart sank. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself that it was just a coincidence. But as I made a turn, the car behind me followed, and I knew that I was in trouble. My mind raced with fear and panic as I tried to come up with a plan. I could feel my heart beating faster and faster as the car behind me closed in. I tried to speed up, but the car matched my pace. Suddenly, I heard a voice on my phone. It was a distorted, robotic voice that filled me with dread. "I've been waiting for you," the voice said. "You can't escape me." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I tried to focus on the road ahead. But the car behind me was relentless, and it seemed like it was getting closer and closer. I tried to call the police, but my phone was dead. I was alone, with no one to help me. Suddenly, the car behind me rammed into my bumper, and my car spun out of control. I could hear the sound of screeching tires and the crunching of metal as my car collided with another vehicle. When I came to, I was lying on the side of the road, my head spinning. I tried to get up, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was bleeding and bruised, and I knew that I had to get away before the car that had been following me caught up. I managed to crawl to the side of the road, and I looked back to see the car that had been following me pulling up. The driver got out, and I could see that it was a man, but I couldn't make out his face. He started to walk towards me, and I could feel the fear rising in my chest. I tried to crawl away, but my body was weak and I could barely move. The man loomed over me, and I could feel his breath on my face. "You can't run from me," he said. "I will always be with you." And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses. They told me that I had been in a terrible accident and that I was lucky to be alive. But I knew the truth. The man who had followed us on the road trip had found me, and he wasn't finished with me yet. The horror of that night stayed with me, and I knew that I could never let my guard down. The road trip that was supposed to be a fun adventure had turned into a nightmare that had changed me forever. After spending weeks recovering in the hospital, I thought that the nightmare was finally over. But as I was leaving the hospital, I saw a familiar face in the crowd. It was the man who had followed us on the road trip, and he was grinning at me. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. How was it possible that he had survived the accident? I felt like I was going crazy, like I was trapped in a nightmare that I could never escape. But then, as I started to panic, the man suddenly collapsed. It turned out that he had a heart attack and died on the spot. I couldn't believe it. It was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, and I felt like I could finally move on with my life. However, as I was driving home, I started to notice strange things happening around me. My car would stall for no reason, and I would hear strange noises coming from the trunk. I started to feel like I was being followed again, but every time I looked behind me, there was no one there. One day, as I was driving down the highway, my car suddenly veered off the road and crashed into a tree. I was lucky to survive, but when the police arrived, they found something strange in my trunk. It was a tape recorder, and on it, they heard the distorted voice that I had heard on the night of the accident. The tape recorder belonged to me, but I had no memory of buying it or using it. It was like someone else had put it there, someone who was trying to drive me insane. It turned out that the man who had followed us on the road trip had a twin brother, and he had been the one who had been haunting me. He had been following me, sabotaging my car, and driving me to the brink of insanity. It was the ultimate plot twist, one that left me feeling terrified and violated. In the end, the truth came out, and the twin brother was brought to justice. But the horror of those months stayed with me forever. I learned that sometimes, the scariest monsters are the ones that are hiding in plain sight, waiting to strike when you least expect it. Even after the twin brother had been brought to justice, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still not right. I still felt like I was being watched, and I couldn't help but wonder if there was someone else out there, waiting to take revenge on me. One day, as I was driving home from work, I noticed a car that seemed to be following me. It was the same make and model as the car that the twin brother had driven, and I knew that I couldn't ignore the feeling of dread that was creeping up inside me. I tried to shake the car off, taking random turns and going down different streets, but the car continued to follow me, always keeping a safe distance. It felt like I was stuck in a bad dream, with no way to wake up. Eventually, I ended up on a deserted road, surrounded by nothing but fields and trees. It was the perfect place for an ambush, and I knew that I had to act fast if I wanted to survive. I reached for my phone, but before I could call for help, I heard a voice coming from the radio. It was the same distorted voice that I had heard before, and it was telling me to pull over. I tried to ignore it, but the voice grew louder and more insistent, until it was all I could hear. And then, suddenly, my car shut off, and I was left stranded in the middle of nowhere. I tried to start the car, but it wouldn't budge. It was like someone had cut the engine, and I was completely helpless. And then I saw it. A figure in the distance, walking towards me. I couldn't make out who it was, but I knew that it was the person who had been following me. I tried to get out of the car, but the doors were locked. I was trapped, with no way to defend myself. The figure got closer and closer, and I could see now that it was a woman. She was wearing a hooded cloak, and I couldn't see her face. Please, let me go, I begged, but she didn't respond. Instead, she opened the door of my car and got in. And then, she spoke. I'm sorry, she said, and then everything went black. When I came to, I was back on the highway, my car running smoothly, with no sign of the woman or the car that had been following me. It was like the whole thing had never happened. But I knew the truth. The woman who had been following me was the sister of the twin brother who had died in the accident. She had been seeking revenge for his death, and she had nearly succeeded. The horror of that day stayed with me, and I knew that I could never let my guard down. Even though the danger was gone, the memories and the fear remained, a constant reminder that sometimes, the scariest monsters are the ones that are hiding in plain sight, waiting to strike when you least expect it. As I sat there in my car, trying to process what had just happened, I couldn't help but think how ridiculous it all was. I mean, who gets stalked by the vengeful sister of a dead twin brother, only to be rescued by a ghost radio DJ and a talking GPS? I started to laugh, but then I remembered the terror that had gripped me just moments before, and the laughter turned into a nervous giggle. And then, just as I thought things couldn't get any stranger, I heard a voice coming from my GPS. It wasn't the robotic voice that I was used to hearing, but a high-pitched, cartoonish voice that sounded like it belonged in a Saturday morning cartoon. Hello there, driver, the GPS said, in a chipper tone. I hope you're enjoying your ride. Say, have you seen any ghosts around here? I stared at the GPS in shock, wondering if I was losing my mind. No, I haven't seen any ghosts, I said, unsure of what else to say. Oh, that's too bad, the GPS said. I was hoping to get a good scare today. I just love spooky stuff, don't you? I didn't have time to answer, because just then, the radio crackled to life again, and the ghost DJ was back. Hey there, listener, the ghost DJ said, his voice echoing through the car. Did you have a run-in with my sister? She's a bit of a prankster, but she means well. I hope she didn't scare you too badly. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A ghost DJ and his prankster sister, a talking GPS that loved spooky stuff. It was like I had stumbled into some kind of twisted sitcom. But as funny as it all seemed, the fear was still there, lurking in the back of my mind. Because even though the ghosts and the GPS were amusing, they were also a reminder that anything could happen when you were driving alone at night. And as I drove home, I couldn't help but wonder what other strange and terrifying things awaited me on the road ahead. As I continued driving, I couldn't help but feel a bit jumpy after my encounter with the ghostly DJ and the prankster sister. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a spectral figure looming behind me. But then I saw something even more ridiculous, a giant chicken running across the road. I slammed on the brakes, and the chicken skidded to a halt right in front of my car. It was massive, at least 3 feet tall, with bright yellow feathers and beady black eyes that seemed to stare right through me. What the? I muttered, trying to make sense of the bizarre sight. And then, just as I thought things couldn't get any weirder, the chicken started to speak. Excuse me, sir, can you give me a lift? It said, in a high-pitched voice that sounded oddly familiar. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I was hallucinating. But when I opened them again, the chicken was still there, looking up at me with its beady eyes. Sure? I said, uncertainly. Where do you need to go? I'm trying to get to the other side of the road, the chicken said, with a hint of exasperation in its voice. But it's really hard when you're a chicken, you know? I couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. A ghost DJ, a prankster sister, a talking GPS, and now a giant chicken? It was like I had driven into the Twilight Zone. But as I drove the chicken across the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something even more bizarre was waiting for me just around the corner. And as much as I wanted to laugh it all off, I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of unease. Because when things got this strange, there was no telling what might happen next. As I dropped off the chicken on the other side of the road and drove off, I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just out of sight. I turned up the radio, hoping to drown out the uneasy thoughts in my head. But just as I started to relax, the radio crackled to life again, and the ghost DJ was back. Hey there, listener, the ghost DJ said, his voice colder and more menacing than before. I hope you enjoyed the ride. Because now, it's time to pay the toll. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. But it was too late. A spectral figure had appeared in front of my car, blocking my way. It was the ghost of the DJ's vengeful sister, and this time, there was no mistaking her intentions. She was out for blood. I tried to reverse, but the car wouldn't move. It was like something was holding it in place, keeping me trapped. The ghostly sister advanced towards the car, her eyes glowing with a malevolent energy. I could feel the terror rising inside me, threatening to overwhelm me completely. And then, just as I thought all was lost, the GPS spoke up again. Don't worry, driver, it said, its voice oddly soothing. I know a shortcut out of here. The GPS directed me down a winding road, its directions getting more and more confusing with each passing moment. But as I followed its instructions, I realized that we were heading towards the abandoned graveyard on the outskirts of town. I tried to protest, but the GPS was insistent. And as we pulled up to the graveyard gates, I saw why the ghost of the vengeful sister couldn't cross over into hallowed ground. With a final scream of rage, the ghost vanished into the night. And as I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder, was it all just a strange, surreal dream? Or had I truly encountered the supernatural on that dark and lonely road? Thanks for watching. Information with you. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next video.